Is the blue Crocodile starter deck actually underrated? Let's talk about it. What's up, captains? Welcome back to The Other Decks. My name is Casual Dobo, and today we're going to be doing our analysis of the Blue Crocodile starter deck, the Seven Warlords starter deck for the English release of the One Piece TCG. So at the time of this recording, there's actually super pre-release events happening tomorrow. So I wanted to get this out pretty quickly, still go into a lot of the details that I went into in my other analysis decks, the ones for Luffy and the ones for Kid. If you haven't checked it out, check it up here. But I wanted to kind of just speed up the process a little bit, not just so that you can have the information in a timely manner, but also so that I can cut down on my editing time. Because to be honest, this week's been a little wild in my real life job, so it's been a little tough to, edit at nights. But anyway, I've already talked like way too much, more than anticipated. I don't even have enough time to tell you to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how busy, how fast we're going. So let's just go ahead and jump into the analysis. Alright, and here we are, and I want to start off with the question, why should you play the Crocodile starter deck? One, you're a huge fan of control decks. If you like controlling your opponent's board, you are going to love the Crocodile starter deck. Next, if you're a huge fan of the Seven Warlords, it's an awesome cast of pirates from the One Piece anime, the One Piece manga, and so if you're fans of all the Warlords, this is the deck for you. But probably more importantly, if you played Blue in the Digimon card game, this is the deck for you. It has a lot of the same mechanics that the Digimon Blue decks had, in which there's a lot of bounce to hand abilities. And honestly, that is probably one of the biggest strengths of the deck. Speaking of strengths, let's go over strengths and weaknesses. So I would say that the biggest strength for the Blue starter deck is that it pretty much has all the answers for the Kid starter deck. Now, if you saw my video last time, I did mention I think the Kid starter deck is probably the best of the 4 starter decks coming out. However, it's not like impervious, right? It will lose matchups, and honestly its hardest matchup is the Blue starter deck. It's because the Blue starter deck can actually answer a lot of the biggest threats the Kid puts out onto the board, right? Let's take a look at the event card Sables. Sables is a 4 cost to play event card whose main ability is return one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 7 or less to its owner's hand. That is literally every character the Kid starter deck can put out. And also, its trigger ability is activate this card's main effect. So, whether it comes out of life or comes out from your hand, this is dangerous to, blocker Kid, who is significantly less scary if it's not on the board. And then very similar to this is the Doflamingo card, the super rare from the starter deck. It only comes at 2 copies, but its ability is pretty good. 7 cost to play, 7,000 power, no counter potential, but that's to be expected of our big character cards. But on play, return a cost 7 or lower character to its owner's hand. And then even our leader itself is able to bounce cards to our opponent's hand. So Dawn, -4, return up to 1 cost 5 or lower character to its owner's hand. This doesn't target, 7 cost Kid, but it targets a lot of the other problematic characters in the green starter deck. But that's enough about its anti-Kid kit. Let's talk about some of the other strengths it has. First of all, it has cheap blockers. So while it's not the only starter deck to have 2 different blockers in it, it is the only starter deck to have a 1 cost blocker and a 3 cost blocker. Because if you think about, the green and the purple, which are other examples, their secondary blocker is either a 5 cost, which I think Queen is, and then obviously 7 cost blocker Kid in green. But Blue has some very cheap blockers with the 1 cost Law, as well as the 3 cost Boa Hancock. And honestly, its ability to play really cheap defensive pieces is probably the greatest strength that it has in combination with its utility. So besides the bouncers that I talked about earlier, this also has card draw, which in this game, unlike the Digimon card game, card draw is pretty rare. So to have abilities that have that sort of built in is pretty nice. And also, you can actually cheat characters out from the deck, which is wild. Now, what about the weaknesses? So I will say its probably biggest, most glaring weakness is its sort of lack of offensive firepower. Its max power character is Doflamingo at 7k, and none of the Blue characters' abilities are really, I would say, offensive. It's just bouncing things back to your opponent's hand, which it can be powerful, but I would not say it is the most offensive effect in the game. So this is a very defensive oriented starter deck. Also, the super rare Crocodile is kind of meh. Personally, I really don't like it. Which, now that I think about it, you can count it as a third blocker because it does have blocker, once again adding to the defensiveness of this, but I really wish it wasn't, because it is 6k, it can attack, and yet we have to make a choice between whether we use it to attack or whether we use it to defend, and honestly, I kind of hate that. And then the last weakness I would say is that it does have some kind of rough ratios. It does have more event cards, which is pretty interesting, but it only has 2 2k counters, and a lot of those cool utility cards I was, talking about, or at least going to talk about, it only comes as 2 ofs. So, out of the box, and we'll talk about, maybe there's a spoiler alert for what I'm going to say later, but out of the box, it is a little weak in my opinion. I think it gets a lot better if you're able to get 2 starter decks and then use it for the deck limited battles. So not necessarily super pre-release, but a little bit of advice for the future. Alright, now let's quickly go over the card list for the deck. So obviously we have 1 copy of our leader Crocodile, 4 copies of Edward Weevil, 2 copies of Blocker Crocodile, 2 copies of Gecko Moria, who's actually pretty cool because it adds a little bit of recursion, 2 copies of Mihawk, which is our 2k counter, and also a little bit of card draw, 4 copies of Jinbei, 2 copies of Sentamaru, that is the character that will cheat out Pacifistas from our deck, 4 copies of Blocker Law, 2 copies Doflamingo, 4 copies Bartholomew Kuma, 4 copies of Buggy, 4 copies Pacifista, 4 copies of Boa Hancock, so a lot of blockers here, 2 copies of Marshall D. Teach, aka Blackbeard, and then this is where the ratios kind of get pretty interesting. 4 copies of Sables, probably the most powerful event card to come out of the starter decks, 4 copies of Thrustbat Cannon, and 2 copies of Level of Beam. And in terms of our Dawn Curve, we're looking at 8 1 cost, 8 total 2 cost cards, 10 3 costs, 10 4 costs, 2 5 costs, and 2 7 costs. And then altogether there are 34 counters up here. Keep in mind that 6 of them are event counters. And now that we've sort of talked about the deck as a whole, let's dive into some of the key characters, key combos that you'll want to see. Alright, so first up is our leader Crocodile. This is a 5,000 power, 5 life leader, so you do put 5 cards into your life area. Typical for a monocolor leader, especially in this stage of the game. 7 Warlords of the Sea and Baroque works, so some dual synergy there. But main effect, activate main once per turn. Dawn -4, so return Dawn to your Dawn deck, and then return up to 1 cost 5 or lower character to its owner's hand. So pretty powerful because this covers a bulk of the characters that are being played by the starter decks. Now Dawn -4 might seem a little rough, especially since there is no ramp in blue currently, but honestly this has come up in a couple different ways. You can check out some of the matches I played on my live stream, but it's a pretty good ability, especially if it is controlling your opponent's board in the sort of mid game, so that their like mid-level characters can't really get any swings in on you. In a very similar vein, I did want to talk about Doflamingo, aka Dofi. So this is a 7 cost to play, 7,000 power, on play, return a cost 7 or lower character card to its owner's hand. Once again, if you're playing green, your main target is going to be 7 cost Kid. And obviously there's a lot of viable targets for this. The only thing that it can't touch is, I believe it's the 9 cost Kaido from the starter deck. But no, this I would say definitely has some extra utility, just because it is probably going to be one of your primary attackers, and also it has an on-play ability, so it does get that when it goes onto the field. Next up, and this is just like a one to point it out, but I wanted to point out our 2 cheap blockers, Law and Boa Hancock. And then if you also notice on Boa, she has a trigger ability that says play this card. So the ability to get a blocker out of life is pretty nice, and that kind of makes up for the fairly, steep cost of having 3 costs to play. For only 1,000 power, a little rough, but she also does, have a trigger, but also counter potential. And these 2 cards are actually pretty important for a combo I'm going to show off later, which involves the event card Thrustbat Cannon. But I'll show that off in Tabletop Simulator in just a bit. Next up, let's take a look at Sentamaru. Sentamaru is the card that allows us to cheat out the Pacifista. So 3 costs to play, 4,000 power, does have counter potential, which is pretty nice. And it has a bit of a wonky ability. So Dawn times 1, you do have to attach 1 Dawn onto Centauro in order to activate the ability. Activate main once per turn. 2. So that means to rest 2 Dawn in your cost area. So in total, you are going to need 3 available Dawn, and that's, excluding the 3 that it costs to play Centauro. But anyway, rest 2 Dawn, have a Dawn attached. Now you can play up to 1 cost 4 or lower Pacifista from your deck, then shuffle your deck. So this is actually cool because it not only allows you to play a Pacifista from deck, but also gives you the ability to shuffle your deck, which if you've played any sort of Magic, especially blue in Magic, you know that it can be pretty important to be able to shuffle, right? Because a lot of times you are returning stuff to the bottom of your deck with some of your search abilities. So if you're able to shuffle, there's a possibility that those things you put at the bottom can sort of resurface and you can find them back at the top again. Or at least like a better shot at finding it, right? So that's why Centauro is cool. And then the last thing I want to talk about were the 2 main event cards coming out of the starter deck. So we've talked about this one already a little bit. 4 cost to play Sables, return 1 of your opponent's characters with cost of 7 or less to the owner's hand, and then trigger activate this card's main effect. And the fact that this comes at a 4 of in the box is brilliant. I love that. You know what I wish came at a 4 of? Level of Beam. So this is our best counter in the deck. It's 2 costs to play. Your leader or up to 1 of your characters gains plus 4,000 power during this battle. Then you get to draw 1 if you have 3 or less cards in your hand. And once again, that ability to draw is pretty rare in the One Piece TCG. So this is kind of a godsend when it comes to deck building. And now that we've talked about the main cards, let's go to Tabletop Simulator and show off some of the combos that you can do with this deck. Alright, so here we are in Tabletop Simulator, and the first one I want to show off is the Blocker Thrust Pad Cannon combo. So if you look at Thrust Pad Cannon, it says counter, return a character with a cost of 3 or less to its owner's hand. However, it never specifies that it has to be your opponent's character. So essentially, you can use your blocker to redirect an attack and then pop your blocker off the board so that the attack essentially fizzles. So what do I mean? So take a look here. Our opponent is now attacking with this character. I'm going to declare in the block step a block with a law, and then during the counter step I'm going to pay 2 and then play Thrust Pad Cannon. I'm going to target my own law with the ability, and then it comes back to my hand before damage step. And because the attacker was redirected to my blocker, but the blocker is no longer there is no damage step to be had. And so essentially, this is a way to block an incoming attack while also protecting our blocker. And that way, next turn, we can just play him out again. And as a reminder, this is the only starter deck that has fairly cheap blockers with a 1 cost and a 3 cost. And then the last thing I want to show is what I'm calling the Anti-Kid Wombo combo. And there's actually been a couple of people who have showed this off already. But essentially, with just 4 Dawn, you can ruin a green player's day. So say you're playing against green and they have both Hawkins and the 7 cost Kid out on the field. So what you do, with even just 4 Dawn, you pay 4, play Sables, return the blocker Kid to the opponent's hand, and then use your leader's ability to -4 those rested Dawn that you just used, put them back into Dawn deck, and then return to Hawkins. Now you're probably thinking that's a lot of steps to return 2 characters to hand, but think about it. 1, they can no longer block with the Kid, and also 2, if their Hawkins was going to be eligible to attack next turn, it no longer is, because they have to pay 5 to put it back out onto the field, and it will still not be able to attack because that's the first turn it's out. So essentially, you've stalled the green player for at least 2 turns to put their board back together again. And because these are abilities, they can't stop that. So yeah, a pretty fun wombo combo if the mood strikes. So that is everything I have to say about the blue starter deck. Let's hand out some grades for this. So first and foremost, power out of the box, 4 out of 5. Alright, so I was gonna say 4 out of 5, however, that was honestly me rounding up because I was like, I don't want to deal with decimals. However, I'll make an exception for this. This is a 3.5 out of 5. I think that the cards presented in this deck are very good. There's a lot of utility, there's card draw, there's recursion, there's cheating cards out from your deck. However, and this is where I dock it for the 0.5, the ratios of those cool utility cards is awful. They only come at 2 of. And you know, if you're familiar with Bandai starter decks, this makes sense because they tend to limit the cool stuff, the really powerful stuff, to 2 copies in their starter deck products. Now, is it cool that we have 4 Sables? Awesome. Did we need 4 thrust pad cannons? I don't think so. So yes, the blue starter deck can be powerful, but I do firmly believe that, you know, if you're going to go into deck limited battles with blue, get 2 copies of the starter deck and then make your own ratios. But that's why I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5. Next, upgradability. 3 out of 5. So, of the starting leader cards, Crocodile is probably the least used in the first set. Most people are opting for blue purple or even the Doflamingo leader. But an easy way to upgrade this, like I said, could be just fixing the ratios and buying a second starter deck and then putting in the good stuff. But where does this deck really shine? In the staples. I'm giving this a 5 out of 5. It's really good. Now, it's not going to seem good at first because I'm going to say 5 out of the 16 cards are meta. And you're like, whoa, that's worse than, you know, the stuff that came out of the red and the green decks, right? Yes, but hear me out. The 2 event cards that come out of the starter deck, Sables and Love Beam, are pretty much universally used in every single blue and every single blue-purple deck that has been created. And that's because those event cards are really good. Arguably, they're so good that it doesn't even matter what the other 3 meta cards that came out of this are, but I'll list them anyway. So the meta cards, in my opinion, here are Mihawk, because he's a 2k counter and also card draw, Trafalgar Law, who is our cheap blocker, Sentimaru, who is, you know, the thing that cheats out our pacifistas. But yeah, really that Sable's Love Beam is enough to carry it to a 5 out of 5 in my humble opinion. The other thing is that almost everything else in this is kind of a contender because of the strength of the 7 Warlords archetype, especially if you're using Doflamingo. So in total, that puts me at 11.5 out of 15. And is that ranking enough for me to say that this is underrated? I definitely think so. I think it's underrated because on the surface, it is kind of like a bad starter deck out of the box. But if you're willing to take a chance on this, I think it can pay off with some huge dividends in the deck limited battles, because I think this is probably, once the ratios are fixed, probably the strongest contender to win some events out of there. But also, it's great to pick up for any blue players for the first set, because there are just some good things. And then if you're a fan of, you know, anything blurple, blue, you're going to want to pick this up, because the individual cards themselves in this deck are awesome. Deck builders are just going to need to find a way to figure it out. And that's all I got. And now I'd love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below what you thought about this analysis and what you think about the blue starter deck. Is it better than what people were saying? Is it worse than what people were saying? Let me know. Love to chat about it. Now, if you did enjoy this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate it. The last couple videos we've done have, you know, done pretty awesomely in my opinion, and so thank you so much for the support. Really appreciate it. But anyway, if you want to learn some more information about the other starter decks that you could use in the super pre-release, check out this video here. And captains, remember, build what you like, play what you love, and I'll catch you in the next video. Have a good one.